groups. We're so glad that you guys are joining with us today, that you're continuing to go through this series entitled Culture Shock. We're looking at 1st and 2nd Peter. We're in week 2 of this series, and the primary passage that we're drawing from today is 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12. Last week we talked about living out this living hope, allowing that to permeate us, allowing that to live through us. And the proposal really this week, the idea is that if we live our lives in such a way that this living hope exudes from us, that people will naturally question and wonder, man, how are they doing that? Why are they living the way that they're living? How come they're not reacting the way that everybody else in the culture does in situations that they ought to react differently? You know, how can we forgive people? How can we give those things away and be generous? How can we let somebody that's wronged us, how can we let them get away with things like that? So literally the lifestyle question is if we live our lives like we're supposed to, it will make people wonder, what is it that really drives us? Now, the primary passage that we're looking at today that we're going to draw from is 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12. And this is what Peter wrote to the early church then and in the first century, and to us too. He says, live such good lives among the pagans that though they may accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that he visits us. Live such good lives that although they can accuse you, they're going to see your good deeds and they're going to glorify God on account of that. Man, how cool would that be if we could do that? We could live our lives in such a way that those things happen. There was a book written about 20 years ago now called The Rise of Christianity. And this fellow named Rodney Stark wrote this book and had a proposal for how the early church was able to grow so fast. And so what he did was look at the second half of the first century as well as the second and third century. And when he looked at the early church and how it was able to grow, what he saw was the way that early Christians reacted, not to each other necessarily, but to the culture. And what he saw was there was several pandemics at the time that happened, whether it was an influenza or different epidemics that happened. And the Christians' response was really unbelievable, okay? And so what we saw in those different times was that people that had family members or friends that had contracted these viruses or contracted or been a part of these pandemics, they just left them. They left them in a room in the house and they just went and took off, or they left them along the side of the road and just left them to die. And so what we saw though in this study and in this book was that early Christians would come and they would find these people and they would take care of them, and they'd either try to nurse them back to health if possible, or if they couldn't do that, even if those passed away, they would, give them a proper burial. And so they took care of countless hundreds, thousands of people that were not being taken care of, and people that they didn't even know. And so what we saw from that study is that people wanted to be a part of those events. People wanted to be a part of this thing called Christianity because they saw people living differently than the culture that they saw living out. And so, we just want to challenge you guys to focus on this 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12. There's several questions to answer for you guys to really think about how we can live counter-culturally, how we can live in such a way that people wonder, how are they living like that?